Hi guys, this is Andrew with headphones.com. Today we're going to take a look at the Abyss AB1266 Phi TC planar magnetic over-ear open back headphones that come in at least $5,000. I think you can buy some of the packages here or with different accessories for quite a bit more than that, but at the very least the headphones cost $5,000. So this is a absolutely prohibitively expensive summit tier flagship headphone from Abyss. And we're gonna take a look at it in this video, but I do wanna give a quick shout out to a friend of mine, Humble, who sent this in for review. So big thanks to Humble for doing that. But in any case, in this video, I'm gonna compare it against some other flagships as well, some of my favorite headphones out there. So let's see how it stacks up. And before jumping into the review here, guys, I just want to let you guys know that if you're curious about the measurements that have been done of this headphone, including more of the measurements than I'm showing here, like I'm just going to show frequency response and a couple of different behaviors. But if you're curious about, the additional measurements that I do, like the distortion measurements and on-head response, stuff like that, that will be linked in the description. It's up on the headphone community forum already. So if you want to check that out, definitely go there. I've also posted my full impressions there if you want a written version of this. But without further ado, let's get into the headphone here, and I'll begin with the usual stuff, but I actually want to just give a quick nod to the case and the cable here. Let me just get the case. This is the case, right? So you got your nice Slytherin green top in a wooden case. It's kind of no nonsense, and I kind of like that. This is it's my kind of thing. And then there's a baggie right there. All right, so here's the cable that this one was sent with, and there is a XLR adapter here. So if you want to run it with your balanced amplifiers, you can do that. But you can also hook it up with a single-ended one here, a little adapter. I don't have that much commentary on the cable. It's fine, it'll do. It's not, particularly annoying to use. I don't have any real issues with it. Now, taking a look at the headphones themselves, actually, it's kind of funny when you first get these headphones. They're in the box, and you kind of have to like assemble it a little bit. So the pads, they just sort of snap off magnetically, which is pretty sweet, actually. The headband here also, I'm not going to take it off right now, but there's these little notches where you kind of have to hook the headband into, and then it creates this sort of elastic system. And there's no action inwards for the arms whatsoever. It's just a straight piece down. The only mechanical action that there seems to be on this headphone is at the top, which you can either pull it out like this, or it has a little bit of movement this way to and fro. So you can adjust it depending on the fit. I think the idea there was to let listeners adjust it how they want, because the sound does change depending on the positioning that you have it at. For me, in the most common position that I got, it was the default, just straight across the top position, and I found that to be the most comfortable. What's funny is I recently went to the dentist to get some x-rays done, and they have this machine at the dentist where you kind of have to walk into it, and there's these two things on either side of your head that clamp to the side of your head. And the Abyss here reminds me of that experience where you kind of have to just oh, okay. I'm walking forward into this thing, into this experience and having this on my head. So for the comfort, it's not great because this is really heavy. I'll leave the weight on the screen here, but it's one of the heavier headphones that you could potentially buy. So up there with the LCD4 and stuff like that for weight. However, because this has a suspension style system up top, it does alleviate a lot of the pressure up top. So it's not actually as uncomfortable for me as I think it could potentially be for somebody else for who maybe this doesn't really work all that well. I've got a bit of a big head, and maybe that actually works to my advantage in this case because it distributes the weight maybe a little bit more across a wider surface. I don't know if that actually is going to matter, but for me, I don't find the actual wearing of it that uncomfortable. It's just that over time the weight does get to me, and that's probably the most immediate downside for me. And I don't think that's particularly unexpected with this headphone. This to me seems like a little bit of a showpiece headphone to see, let's try and make the best sounding thing that we can. That's kind of what it seems like they've gone for here. And for the build quality, this is of course built like a tank because, well, as they've demonstrated in a video that they've done, they've run over this with a Jeep, not this specific unit, but they've run over this model with a Jeep, and it still worked afterwards. So this thing is absolutely built like a tank. It's built to last. In any case, let's talk about the sound quality. And I want to first preempt this by just letting you guys know the sources that I've been using with this, because I have been using a lot, and you do need an amplifier for this. So no iPhone dongles. No iPhone dongles for this one. I spent my time listening with this through a number of amplifiers. the topping A90, the Vioelectric HPA V550, the Burson conductor, the Bakun Amp 13R, which is right here at the moment because I've been trying a bunch of different stuff, including with the HE6. But you guys get the idea. There's been a number of amplifiers that I've been sort of testing with this, and we've had a lot of different ones in, because this does seem to change quite a bit depending on the amplifier. I didn't have the Linus stack on hand, so if I didn't cry, that's clearly why. But in any case, let's talk about the objective stuff first, so the frequency response and the measurements. Just before throwing this up on the screen here, I have to state as clearly as possible that adherence to a target is not the only indicator for good sound quality. It's not the only thing that there is. There are places where it can deviate, and there are places where it should deviate. And so that's not, I don't just base my evaluations on just strict adherence to that. But the data point there is a known data point. It's a reference target for a reason, and it helps us guide the evaluations. So looking at the bass, you can see that it actually does have a little bit of a rise into the sub bass there, which is a good thing in my opinion. And normally with planar magnetic headphones, you actually have a hard time getting that kind of elevation unless you introduce an air gap or some sort of leak, which does suggest, or at least with open back planars, and that does suggest that there is some imperfection with the seal, but I think that's also intentional with this headphone. It's a clever way of achieving some sort of bass shelf there. And then, the further out that it is, so the further that the seal is broken and the more air gap there is, the stronger that bass resonance is going to be. And if anybody's unaware, these planar magnetic headphones, or at least ones that are designed like this, they all have a driver resonance that is going to show up generally in the bass somewhere, depending on the driver, of course. And it also depends on the damping. And with this one, it's very minimally damped, if at all. And so the driver resonance is quite strong on this headphone, meaning that even just a tiny little air gap can give you quite a pronounced bass response. And I'll show you guys the air gap behavior here in a second. But first I wanted to show you what the on-head measurement was, because it does matter for this headphone, again, because depending on the positioning and how it's worn, you can get a different response there. And so using an in-ear microphone, I was able to measure what the bass response was on my head. Now, of course, you can't compare the rest of the frequency response there other than the bass, because you can't compare it to measurements that are meant to be taken at the eardrum, like what you get with the standardized measurement rig there. But for the on-head measurement, you can actually see that I got a little bit more bass than what I got on the rig, meaning that there was a little bit more of a gap, or the seal was broken a little bit more for when I was wearing it than when I had it positioned on the rig in the sort of the standard position. And I know I'm talking about the bass a lot here, but it really does matter with this headphone, because it's kind of one of its party tricks. If you take it completely off, like if you have a completely broken seal with this headphone and have a full air gap, you get one of the most massive bass elevations I've ever seen. Like the resonance frequency on this is enormous. I'm shocked. I've literally never seen anything like this. Whenever I've done this measurement testing other planar magnetic headphones, it's never like this, which to me, this indicates that there is not much driver damping going on at all with this headphone. And so that's one of the reasons why you get this very high peak there in the bass when you break the seal. And it's, again, a clever use of this feature of planar magnetic headphones, this sort of like the way that these planars work, because it allows people to sort of dial in the bass response that they want depending on how well coupled it is to the side of the head. In any case, let's take a look at the rest of the frequency response here, and I have it highlighted here as the middle position, or the default position, because to me this was the one that was the most normal fitting. And I think, again, it's intended to be sort of like adjusted a little bit like backwards and forwards to, maybe get a different sound a little bit, and I think you could do that, but what I found is when I did that, the comfort wasn't really that great for me. So like if I adjust it too far back, I didn't find it very comfortable, and you'd maybe want to like adjust the pad positioning as well when you do that. But so for me, I found that the default position of just sort of like straight across was ideal, and it was mostly, again, coupled with just maybe a slight leak there. In addition to that, it does also change a little bit the frequency response in the upper mids and mids, I suppose. Not that much, but it does change a little bit depending on how forward and how backward it is. I actually think that the Diana headphones, like the Diana Phi that I reviewed a while ago, changed more. But this one does still seem to change. In practice, for me, I found that there was a sort of one position that fit the best and also seemed to sound the most, normal to me. But unfortunately, it wasn't that normal overall, because the overall tuning of this headphone is pretty strange, actually. It's pretty weird. Specifically in the mids, you get this really strong, pronounced section at around 1 to 1.2K. And this makes the whole thing sound a little bit on the honky, boxy side of things. When you drop this by a few dB with EQ, it really kind of reveals how much of an effect that has, at least for me. I know not everybody's going to hear it that way, but that's sort of how I hear it. And so when I was making some adjustments there with EQ, it was like, oh yeah, this is definitely a little bit on the boxy side. And then it does have some ear gain there in the upper mids, which is nice. It's not as much as you would want, and it's almost like this, the fact that it's not full ear gain there, it almost sort of like exacerbates the problem in the mids at around 1.2K. So I think if it had been like one or the other, it would have been okay, but the combination of the two is like, it's just a little bit too claustrophobic for me for the tuning. But then when you get into the treble, there's a peak there at around 5K, and normally this is something that would really bother me, because when you see a 5K peak that's sort of elevated over the treble harmonics above that, it can have this very compressed sound to percussive hits and cymbal hits and things like that. And because it's, one lower harmonic is emphasized over the resonant harmonics above it. And with this headphone, thankfully, you do have decent presence in the mid treble, and then you actually have, elevated presence in the upper treble as well. And that sort of serves to balance out that 5K peak, so that in spite of the fact that it looks a little bit uneven there and ragged, your treble response here is actually pretty good. I think that the treble response, it's a little boosted in the air, a little bit, unnaturally, I don't know, shimmery, but it sounds smoother than it looks. And so I'm not as bothered. I'm not really at all bothered by the 5K peak in this instance, just because it is more balanced out by the rest of the harmonics there. So overall, you have here what I could only really describe as somewhat of a W-shaped frequency response. And if you're somebody who knows that you like that, then that's not gonna be a problem. But for me, it was definitely too strange for frequency response. And I was, comparing it with a number of other headphones, like, the go-tos here, the HE6, the original HE6s, which are actually a little bit pulled back there. Same thing with the Susvara is a little pulled back there as well. So I was comparing this with a number of different headphones and found that elevation in the mids was just a little too much for me. But there's one other thing about the measurements here that I wanna note, and what I found with this headphone is that it does also have very uncharacteristically high distortion behavior. Whether or not it's audible, I think with music playing, probably not. But the main thing there for me is that it makes me worry a little bit about, doing EQ to this headphone. And I do think that it kind of needs it, at least for me. So what I do is I kind of go minimal on the EQ. I just sort of drop that mid-range bump a little bit. Not too much, just by maybe like 3 dB, and I don't really get into the more fine-grained EQ with this headphone. So I just leave the rest as is, and it ends up sounding pretty good after I do that EQ, but just very minimal, very wide Q values on your filters there. Now let's get into the subjective stuff with this headphone, because I know there's a lot of people who are like, okay, frequency response, whatever. How's the detail? All right, let's get into it. So I think you guys are probably wondering, how does this compare against the Susvara and the LCD4 and some of the other ridiculous detailed headphones? I think this is up there with the very best of them. Specifically, the immediacy of the initial leading edge is extremely tight sounding and very fast sounding, and then there's really good clarity for the trailing ends of tones, just like there is for the Susvara. And so for that quality, I think it's right up there. For instrument separation as well, it's just fantastic, and it has this amazing depth presence to it as well, where you can really sort of like look forward into the music, which is fantastic. So yeah, the detail here is outstanding. It's phenomenal. For soundstage, it's good, but it's also not like crazy. I still think maybe the Susvara is a little bit little more spacious sounding, a little wider, but pretty darn close, and it's fine. And then again, this does have pretty good depth to it, and like structural definition for the images and image placement and all that stuff. It's very incisive. Additionally, for the macro contrast quality, or the macro dynamics quality, and you guys are looking at the HE6, the original here, how does it stack up? Yeah, the Abyss is one of like 3 planar magnetic headphones that does this quality exceptionally well. The punch and slam is just, it's mighty. Like, I think it rivals that of the HE6. And I'm gonna say that this punches harder. This has that macro contrast quality more so than the Susvara. I think the other contender there is the Odyssey LCD4, but I need to get a new one of those in, because they did change the pads. And lastly, for the timbre, I think the real issue with the timbre here is more the frequency response related stuff. So, yes, this is a planar planar and it does sound like a planar. It's got that sort of plucked character that planars typically have, but the main sort of like, I guess, negative timbre aspect would be that it sounds a little bit sort of metallic and boxy and artificial as a result of that somewhat forward mid-range there, the 1.2K emphasis there. So this is definitely not the most natural sounding headphone if that's something that you really care about, but I would trade that away for the detail that this has in a heartbeat. So, it all depends on what you care about. It depends on what qualities and what categories are really important to you. So I've sort of been comparing this to a couple of different headphones throughout this review, and I'm going to leave you with this. This to me sounds like a weirdo Susvara with better, macro dynamics and contrast there. So I definitely have a clear preference for the Susvara over this headphone because I don't really care as much about the slam quality as I do about the tuning and the frequency response. And for me, the Susvara nails it, whereas the Abyss really is just too strange for me there. So do I recommend the Abyss AB1266 Phi TC? Certainly not as a conventional headphone to use for most of the day. I don't think that's what they're going for with this. I don't think that's what this is supposed to be. For people who are looking for that, you want to look, from their lineup. I think you'd be better served with maybe like a Diana 5 with a little bit of EQ or something like that. But this headphone is more of that, I guess, showpiece headphone. For anybody who's like into a W-shaped kind of sound, then sure. But for me, I would definitely still prefer the Susvara or the Utopia as sort of like the endgame headphones. And this doesn't really unseat those as my preferred ones personally. But yeah, I mean, it is definitely impressive what they were able to achieve as far as those other qualities. And so I think if they can kind of dial in the tuning there a little bit better, make it a little bit more sort of normal for what most people prefer, I think they'll have something awesome on their hands. And I think they really need to get that distortion in check. Nonetheless, that's going to do it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.